Copyright Superpowers. This is the second in our series of copyright workshops this month. Who came last week to the copyright basics? Yeah, okay. I know you came. Good. Some of this at the top will be review for some of you. For some of you that's not review, we're still going to go over it at the top. So everybody will be caught up when we get to the meat of today's discussion, which is where special exemptions for libraries and archives regarding U.S. copyright law. Just a note before we get started, we're going to talk a lot about this document today, Title 17 of the U.S. Code, which basically comprises copyright law in the United States. Anywhere you see Section 108, Section 102, Chapter something, we're talking about that document right there. If you want, you can download your own copy from the U.S. Copyright Office and play along today, but it's totally not required. But there's the address there if sometime in the future you decide you need to look things up. There we go. Real quick, this is real basic, but it's worth touching on again because we're going to come back to this concept later. The purpose of copyright, as laid out by the United States Constitution, Article 1, this is the clause that allows Congress to make all the intellectual property law we have in America, right? About copyright, about patents, trademarks, service marks, things like that. That we're promoting the progress of science and the arts by securing, for limited times, exclusive rights for authors and inventors. So exclusive rights for the creators, but with the realization that they should be limited for the progress for science and the arts. So let's dive right in. It's a quick review about some basic copyright stuff. Section 102 tells us what kind of things are protected by copyright law. Original works of authorship fixed in a tangible medium of expression. If you have something that you can write down, that you can record, that can be read or played back later, then that's eligible for protection under U.S. copyright law, which mentions all these different kinds of works, but it's not limited to them, I don't think. Literary works, musical works, which includes sheet music and things like that. It's distinct from sound recordings down here. Stage works, pantomimes and choreographic works, which I always forget about. Pictorial works, like the cover of Fun and Frolic, right here. Motion pictures, audiovisual works, sound recordings, and architectural works. Buildings. Buildings are subject to copyright. So for anybody who was here last week, does anybody remember what copyright entails? There's a bundle of rights that we talk about when we talk about U.S. copyright. Does anybody know what any of them are? The right to distribute copies of things. That's right. Anybody else? No, that's all right. I thought this group would be a little more awake than the morning group yesterday. Here are all the things we talk about when we talk about the exclusive rights of copyright owners. Copyright, the right to make copies, number one. It's right there in the name. The right to make derivative works of your work. The reason that you and I can't get rich making Star Wars movies is because only Lucasfilm can make sequels to Star Wars. Public distribution, public performance, display, broadcast. And for those of you who deal with visual works, there's additional rights laid out in Section 106A and Section 120 for architectural works. Who owns the copyright to a work, to a book, to a movie, to a piece of sheet music? Anyone? The creator? Someone who inherited the intellectual property? Anybody else? Not you. I'm just keeping count. Oh, you're counting, okay. That's right. You guys hit on a couple of the big ones. Yes. Under U.S. copyright law, authors and creators of a work that's been fixed in a tangible medium, automatically that content is protected under U.S. copyright law. Just as soon as you write it down, then it belongs to you. You're the only one that can copy it, distribute it, and in other ways profit from it, really. There are some exceptions, of course. Works made for hire, things that are created during the course of someone's normal employment, normally become copyright of their employer. I think technically all these slides today are copyright Florida State University, for example. And of course, there are lots of exceptions to that. There are, depending on what kind of contractual agreement you're in with your employer. But in general, that is true. People can inherit copyright. Intellectual property can pass down through the generations just like physical property can. And of course, contractual transfers. Anybody who possesses that bundle of rights that we talked about earlier can sign away one or more of them through a legal contract. And in general, I tend to think of these as sort of just two cases, right? So the copyright persists with the author when it's created, and then they have all these methods to give it away later. Chapter 3, Title 17 tells us how long copyright lasts for works created in the United States. There's a lot of fine detail that I didn't include on this slide, but in general, for most things that you're going to look at, that these are true. Unpublished works are protected by copyright for the life of the author plus 70 years, or 120 years from creation for anonymous or works of corporate authorship, right? Those works for hire we were just talking about. Copyright terms for published works for the life of the author plus 70 years again, or 95 years from publication for works with corporate authorship. So, what does that mean to people who work in libraries, who work in archives? We all perform different services every single day that intersect with U.S. copyright law. We make copies of things all the time to preserve our collections for interlibrary loan. Our users scan and copy things every day. Sometimes we copy things to make them more accessible, right? For people with print disabilities. Sometimes we copy things so we can share them more widely. Share them more widely. Sometimes we share them wildly too. Through databases like digital library and digital, things like that. And of course, one of the first functions you think of when you think of a library is public distribution, right? We send copies out and we try to get them back, but we are distributing copies of things to the public. So probably everybody in this room has done or assisted in one of these services on a daily basis, and yet none of us have been brought up on federal charges for distributing things that we don't own the copyright to. Does anybody know why? What's that?
Because we work in a library?
That's right.
Yes, superpower.
Because the library has copyright superpowers not available to ordinary citizens in the United States. There is a section in U.S. copyright law, Section 108, which directly addresses the functions of libraries and archives. Libraries are one of the few professions that is name-checked in U.S. copyright law, so you can all give yourself a pat on the back for that. It's not explicit in the law, but it's clear to me that somewhere along the line somebody decided that libraries and archives had value in that progress of the arts and the useful sciences that we were talking about earlier. So thus we have Section 108, which provides exemptions for libraries that are making copies controlled by somebody else. Right? The copyright is not owned by the library, but for things like preservation of the library collections, when it's necessary for the private study of things by our library users, and in certain cases to satisfy interlibrary loan requests. Which is not to say that, hey, I work in a library, I can copy whatever I want and do whatever I want with it. That is absolutely not true. There's a lot of restrictions on what libraries and archives can do with material they don't control. First of all, there's a qualification to even, for your repository to even qualify under Section 108. You can't just set up shop and call yourself a library. You have to qualify. You have to be open to your collections have to be open to the public, or at least to specialized researchers in a field, right? Making the copies has to carry no commercial advantage. This is why, for example, Florida State University, the Digital Library Center does not charge reproduction fees for its services. Other university libraries will see a small charge that's intended to cover the cost of paper or the cost of staff time. But anything beyond that, libraries aren't really allowed to make profit from copies made under the provisions of Section 108 here. Any of those copies have to carry a copyright notice, or at least a notice that they might be protected by copyright. You can't just copy anything you want either. Section 108 applies mostly to textual works or textual works with accompanying illustrations. It applies to non-musical sound recordings and to very few audiovisual works, only news programs. And of course, Section 108 is not intended to provide for systematic reproduction or distribution of single or multiple copies. It's not intended to substitute for actually owning the thing. And we'll get into that, how many uses you can get out of a copy before it's not legal anymore. Any questions about that? So with respect to copies made for preservation, replacement, or deposit, there are some requirements. The original copy has to be something that your library owns. You can't just copy something, put it on your shelf, and say, now we have it. It has to be a copy from the institution's collections. It has to be something that you can't get at a fair market price somewhere else, right? And you're not allowed to make more than 3 copies. So this governs any copies made for preservation of something that's fallen apart, like this rare book in the photograph here. For deposit in another library, this is the part of the law that allows for microfilm copies of everything to proliferate in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And of course for replacement, of something that is lost or stolen. Section 108, regarding copies for our library users. We're allowed to make copies for the users, or the users can make their own copies if the copies become property of the library user. You can't just let somebody copy an article and put it back on our shelf and say we own 2 copies of that article. That's not allowed. You have to have had no reasonable notice that the user's use of the copy will be for anything other than private study, scholarship, or research. That's not to say you have to grill everyone making copies or asking for copies of things. But if you know it's going to be for something aside from private study, then it's not exempt under Section 108. Copies, you can copy the whole thing or a substantial portion of a work if you find that another copy cannot be found at a fair market price. It can substitute for a proper copy if you can't get one for yourself. And you have to post proper notice wherever users are making or ordering or receiving copies. Does this look familiar to anyone? This sign right here? Yeah, that's from one of our scanners. I took that picture the other day. But that's why you see these notices everywhere. There are photocopy machines everywhere. There are scanners. It's because it limits the liability of the library in cases where we find out a user does something they're not supposed to with something that they copied at the library. We can say, I told you so. Section 108G is specifically about interlibrary loan. It explicitly provides for interlibrary loan of copies of things from one library to another, provided that such services do not substitute for a journal subscription or for proper purchase of a book. So who's to say how many copies you can give out or you can borrow before it substitutes for the real book? Anybody in here in ILL? What kind of guidelines do we use?
Within 5 years, we get 5 free copies.
Are you familiar with this acronym down here? COMTU? National Commission on New Technological Uses of Copyrighted Works. These are guidelines, not federal law, but these are guidelines that a lot of places use. I wasn't sure if we use them. And they call for no more than 5 copies from a particular work, right? So from any journal, from any magazine, from any book, per calendar year. According to Cantu, if you're giving away 5 articles from any journal in a calendar year, then you probably ought to have a subscription to that journal. And do we keep records of those loans when they go out?
Copyright clearance does.
Copyright clearance does.
So there's a list builds up as years.
Section 108G requires us to keep records for 3 years. I was just wondering if we expanded on that or not. But that's why ILL can do their job. It's because Section 108G. Section 108H is one I always forget about, and I think other people do. Libraries and archives have special powers with respect to things that are late in their copyright term. Sometimes we don't have to wait the whole 95 years for something to hit the public domain. During the last 20 years of any term of copyright for published work, library archives can reproduce, distribute, display, perform, in facsimile or digital form, one of the few places where Section 108 uses the word digital, a copy of a work that is no longer subject to commercial exploitation, and that is if you can reasonably deduce that it's been out of print for a long time, that it's not currently being licensed, basically that no one's trying to make money off it this year. And if another copy is not available at a fair market price, basically if everyone's sort of forgotten about it, libraries have the ability to make copies of it if it's reached the last 20 years of its term of copyright. Any questions about that? You guys are real quiet, so we're getting to the quizzes early. Now that you know everything about Section 108, let's walk through some examples and see what we think. This is adapted from a real-life situation that I had at the University of Illinois a number of years ago. Anthropology professor has been showing the same film to their undergraduate seminar for the last 20 years. Professor normally checks out VHS copy from the library. However, this year, the university facilities decided they don't support VCRs anymore. And they have removed them from the classrooms in the anthropology building, and thus taking away the professor's ability to display this film in class. The film, while considered a classic in the field, has yet to be commercially released on DVD or Blu-ray. So the professor has requested that the library make a copy from the VHS copy that could be played back in the new classroom DVD player. So, my question to you guys, as Section 108 experts now, could the library claim exemption under Section 108 to make a DVD copy for this professor? What do you think? Looking back, is it cheating? Isn't cheating? This is a safe space. You can say whatever you want. If it's wrong, it's still probably a good point for discussion.
I would say it is because they wouldn't gain commercially. It's only a copy for a professor who, once it comes out on DVD, he's going to request it anyway. And it's not for his personal research purposes, but it's for a classroom, which is I know it's very used for images, but I'm not sure it's very used for video, but I feel like maybe it's not fair.
Those are all good points, that it's not commercial and it's scholastic use.
It's not a news program, is it?
It is not a news program.
It could be.
20 questions.
Well, I just want to make sure that this film is not something else. Okay.
So what do you think about that?
I don't know if it's protected under 108, but could it be protected under, I think, is it 107 that you can use education resources?
Someone has been reading ahead to next week's workshop.
I listened to last week's. That's what happened.
No, the library cannot make a copy for use outside the library under Section 108 because it doesn't exempt audiovisual media except for news broadcasts. That's exactly right. What?
Just get it on YouTube.
Let's get it on YouTube. I always say, this side note, I shouldn't even be saying this on recording, but the first consideration in any copyright case is, of course, who's going to care. Right? So, no, you can't do it under Section 108, but, as we're going to talk about later, it shouldn't preclude the library from exploring other kinds of exemptions. A lot of things we just talked about are good discussions for fair use, which is a different section, Section 107. Good job, everybody. You did such a good job, let's try another one. Another one ripped from real life. A film producer has requested copies, we'll say from special collections, of an out-of-print book, which includes large photographs of significant figures from the American Civil Rights Movement. This production company is well known for commercially successful documentary films, with several previous films dealing with the Civil Rights Movement. So, could the archives claim exemption under Section 108 for making a copy of this book? What do we think? Anybody have this side? Yeah.
Why does he want it? Or she want it?
Why does she want it? It doesn't say, does it?
No.
Why do we want to know?
Because I just.
I'm being Socratic. I'm not trying to be a jerk. I'm trying to be Socratic. Why do you think we want to know?
Isn't that something you would ask the person who's requesting copies for? Where are you going to use this for?
Maybe. Anybody else have a thought about that?
Sometimes we don't want to know.
Sometimes we don't want to know.
Dangerous question.
So it's well, it says that it includes large photographs. So maybe they want to use the book as part of a scene for the documentary, which even though documentary sales aren't like crazy huge, it still is a form of income. So I feel like in that case, that would be a no, because they would be using that copy as basically like, not a prop, because it's not a movie, but like kind of a prop in a way. Whereas they could maybe sign a form of like, you sign a form for like photo images to be able to take photos of things. So maybe they can sign that form and then like pay a certain amount to use that photo of it, or sign a form to be able to film in the location and not use a copy of it.
That's why we need to ask what they want to use it for.
Okay. Anybody else? You went through a lot of good stuff, but this is one is a yes or no question. Yes, we can. As long as, and you guys were sort of going down this road, as long as the archives has not received reasonable notice of commercial reuse, you can make a copy of it for private study. We don't have to assume that just because someone has the potential to make an unfair use of something that they're gonna. Just because they work for a film company, you don't have to assume that that's what they're going to do with it.
Is the book still in copyright though, and then you could make 100% copy of it?
That's right. If it's out of print, if it can't be found at a fair market price.
Okay, I thought that was only if it was within the last 20 years of its copyright.
Let's go back. No, let's go back and look at user copies. That's a good question. So we can make copies of the whole work or substantial portions if another copy cannot be found at fair market price. That's right in there.
Right.
It's right in there. That's a good question.
We don't do that.
What I like about the second pop quiz scenario is that it gives a factual scenario where there could be actually an infringing case here where the producer is, let's just say that he's going to do what we all think he's going to do, right? He's going to use it in his movie. That would constitute an infringement. But this is an interesting example where the library kind of facilitated of infringing use, yet they would be not liable as a result of the superpowers that librarians have. They could claim an exemption from liability just because they were there providing the facilitation of the infringement doesn't mean that they would be liable for the actual infringement itself. Now the producer and all those boo-boo bucks from his Oscar-winning documentaries, he would be a great target.
That's right. That's right. That's a good point. And it brings back what I wanted to say. It's not the library or the archive's job to be the copyright police.
What does the notice look like? When you receive reasonable notice?
So that's a good question. What exactly could that mean?
Yeah.
If, like in an initial email from a film producer, they said, hey, I'd like a copy of this book because we're going to use the photographs in the documentary, then you have reasonable notice, right? But they haven't said why. Your default assumption, it's okay for your default assumption to be that it's just for research. Some would argue that if they say, oh, we need copies of this book, and can you please make sure the photograph pages are at 3,200 PPI or something, right? Something like way beyond what you need to read, probably way beyond what you need for broadcast. Then you should be suspicious of that, and then some would argue that it's on the library to ask some follow-up questions at that point. And I would tend to agree, actually. What do you think, Devin?
Yeah, sure.
If someone's asking for high quality,
It's a fine line. I mean, on the one hand, there are so many like forces in our society that exert a freezing effect on like the use of copyrighted materials and kind of try and restrict uses of copyrighted materials. And in that space, like libraries are one of the only institutions that tries to like counteract a lot of that by providing access to information and like encouraging people to use and copy materials in the fair use section 108, what have you. So we want to I think live up to that that role that we play in society, because I think it's an important role, and for some of the young people who actually step up and do it. But at the same time, we do need to look out for the best interests of our patrons, and so we do get the sense that they might be, like in the example that Rory just described, where they're asking for like crazy high resolution. We might want to ask like a follow-up question of like, oh, do you really need like this high resolution? Or even just, this is another reason for developing copyright, FAQs and like documentation guides and that kind of thing in libraries. We might just have, if we had documentation like that, we might be able to just like provide them with that along with the materials and just say, just for your information, and then empower them to make that call with the information provided, so that they could go to the copyright holders and seek a license to use images in the film if they wanted to.
right? And it's worth noting that this is a very simple example, right? This is not actually how this goes down. They're like an anonymous email comes in and an anonymous copy goes out. These kind of duplication efforts usually come out during a conversation or at the tail end of a reference interview, right? In which case you've already sort of explored some of these things. You do have a sense of what they're going to use it for. A lot of places, FSU special collections included, when they fill out the form to request the thing, there's a place to talk about the project, and then in the language of the form that they sign, they assure us that they know that this is for private use or private study only. And that's one of the ways to get around the murkiness, so just put it in the form. Similar to having the notices on the copy machines, right? So we can say later, I told you so. Any more questions about documentary film? Okay. Good discussion. One more. A frugal student has noticed that the textbook for their chemistry class is on the shelf at the university library. That's great, they're using the library. A student would like a digital or print copy of the entire book for their private study this semester. So what do we think? Could the library or the student claim exemption under Section 108 for making a copy of the book?
Not unless it's not available for a good price.
You're saying they could if it's not available at a fair market price. Do you think, there's a joke in there somewhere about textbook prices, but do you think that the current textbook for the chemistry class is available at the bookstore?
I would assume it's not.
Probably. Anybody else had a hand over here?
If the student, could the student take photos of all of the pages that they needed? Would that depend on?
That's sort of the same thing.
I don't know.
They're saying they need all pages. In this example.
In the example, they're requesting all the pages. That's right. That's right.
I'm gonna say no.
You're going to say no?
I'm gonna say no because you can buy the textbook from Amazon for cheaper, or you can just share with your coworker, or you can request it through ILO. Maybe. Or like secret person will put it on reserve, so no.
Anybody else?
Or yeah, or you go like you're the person that goes at the beginning of the semester and checks out all the books you need so that no one else can get to them.
That's right. That's right. That's what would actually happen in this example. This student would just check out the book for the semester, and then no one else would even be able to ask because it wouldn't be on the shelf. That's right. That's what would actually happen.
That's what older requesters.
That's right. Anybody else? Something we'd like to share with the class in the back?
I was just telling a reserve policy.
I actually do have a question though.
Sure.
In this case, I kind of brought up a good point about what if the student takes a picture. Is there any difference in like the ontology of the picture versus a scan? Because the picture is not a scan. It could be an object itself. So if you're creating something new, do you know what I mean? Like,
I do know what you mean.
argue that it's something new and not
Are you
actually
sure you're not
actual.
Right?
The way I think they usually deal with that is like
Yeah,
they start
glad
talking,
someone has an answer.
start talking about copyright as like different layers of rights. So you could create a derivative work, but like the copyright for like the original material is like still holds. So your new copyright in that derivative work would apply only to like the original content of the photo, and not to like the stuff you're actually like interested in from the textbook.
So it's about use, not about or not in this case.
Yeah.
Sure.
An interesting question would be like, could the student do this under fair use? And if not the whole book, how much of it might be permissible to copy under fair use for the purposes of rights? Cool.
Anyway, that's always a good question, right, is whether there are other exemptions that apply. But in this case, no, you were correct, Nicole. You can't copy the whole thing if there's another copy available at a fair price. And for the purpose of our example, the university bookstore has fair prices.
If you could only request, like we do, 30% of the work, right, that's under copyright, the students get together with their friends and 3 of them request 3 different sections of the book and then share?
That's sort of a muddy area, isn't it? Let's go back. That's one of the things.
I guess.
No, it's addressed.
And then the library wouldn't be
Where did we go?
responsible if the students decided to do that, whether or not it's legal for the students to don't get caught.
Right. So the whole point of Section 108 is not to allow that kind of thing, right? I know from talking from our other ILL staff that these kind of things happen, right? Where one individual will be like, Chapter 1, please. Chapter 2, please. Chapter 3, please. Chapter 4, please. And what do we do with those requests here at FSU?
You start with scanning contents, see what they want from there.
So you try to get them to narrow it down. Right. Do we ever have a case where this happens, where multiple users, like one user says Chapter 1, one user says Chapter 2?
Not that I know.
But technically you're not supposed to do it, but like all the things, it comes down to whether someone catches it or not. I don't know if that's a good answer, but I think that's the real answer. Any other questions or comments about our frugal student before we move on? Yes?
Who determines fair market price? And doesn't take into consideration who the person is and like what their income might be? I mean, thinking of an undergraduate income versus like a faculty income, is there really a difference in affordability?
The answer to the second part of your question is no. I don't think that there is any consideration on need or ability to buy by someone. To answer the first part of your question is outside the scope of this presentation. What makes a market price fair, but maybe someone else in the group has an answer.
The way courts treat this is kind of, you're not going to be happy, but as long as it's available in the marketplace, that's its fair market price.
That is the fair market price.
Fair is not about fair.
It's that it's available.
Yeah. I mean, unless it's like an egregious, like, clear overvaluation, rising to the level of, like, not really extortion, but whatever you want. Yeah, like something where it's clearly not worth that, you know, something like that.
So except in obvious exaggerated cases that whatever the market price is the fair market price. Okay. Cool. Anything else? But thanks for participating in a little pop quiz game. So that's section 108. That's how it stands today. There's always a lot of debate about these library and archives exemptions, and every once in a while, a bunch of big brands get together and talk about it. Back in 2005, the U.S. Copyright Office and the Library of Congress sponsored a Section 108 study group to look at Section 108 exemptions as they stood and see if there was anything that deserved discussion, that needed to be changed. They got people from sort of all corners of humanity, people from academia, people from libraries, people from government, people from the commercial sector, right? Publishers are always very interested in what libraries are doing with published material. And so 3 years later, they produced a very interesting report, which you can get yourself here, section108.gov if you're interested. I've done a very brief summary of their recommendations here. One of the things the group recommended is that Section 108 make these exemptions available to museums as well. There's a lot of language in there about libraries and archives, but libraries and archives aren't the only cultural institutions involved in the preservation and providing access to materials. So they recommended that maybe we bring museums into the fold. They actually, I'm sure this recommendation came out of the commercial sector, that there be more criteria for what constitutes a library or an archives. Like we talked about 10 or 15 slides ago. Really the only qualification for an institution under Section 108 is that you have collections and that they be open to the public, or that researchers be allowed to apply to see them. The group recommended that they flesh out this definition to include like typical library and archive services, like if you have reference staff, right? If you have duplication services, then you should qualify as a library, things like that. Things like what kind of training and education do your staff get, right? And most importantly, this one made me laugh out loud when I read it because it wasn't something I normally think about. How are you getting your library materials, right? Can you just put up a sign like these books fell off a truck, don't worry about where they came from, and call yourself a cultural institution? The group says maybe not. The group recommended that they make some provisions for preservation and distribution of born digital works. So I don't know if any of you were thinking about this as we went through the exemptions today, but very few of them make any sense when it comes to the way digital documents work, or the way online distribution, especially of digital documents, works in the 21st century. Limiting yourself to 3 preservation copies of something doesn't even make sense in a digital world. Good digital preservation practice, for starters, calls for multiple copies of things in different places to keep it safe. So in good library and archives practice, you already have more than 3 copies of something. And then if you've already used up your 3 copies for the preservation copy, technically you can't even show it to someone, right? Because that's how computers work. You have a copy somewhere else, and then when you bring it up on your workstation or on your laptop, technically it's not reading that one. It's created a local copy, and that's the one that you're reading. So you get into these absurd situations where you have a preservation copy of something, but you're not allowed to preserve it or provide access to it. So what are you doing? And that's just one example. So they definitely have recommended that Section 108 be modified to keep digital works in mind. And then lastly, another important recommendation is to make provision for outsourcing reproduction services, right? This is something that's evolved in 21st century library practice, is that you have a large collection of things that you want to copy to provide better access to it, right? You have a bunch of things on videotape or something, you don't want to play them back in your library anymore, or you have such a sizable collection of books on paper, that you want to just pay someone to do it all at once. It's too much work to just give to the grad assistant for the semester, right? And so that's a big money area in the law right now. Some of the former grad assistants are laughing. That's good. So the group argued that that ought to be explicitly included there. Those are the big ones out of the 2008 report. The fact that we're still talking about them 9 years later means that, of course, none of this stuff has been really implemented. There have been subsequent discussions of different groups. You can get a brief summary of that from the U.S. Copyright Office if you're interested in what's been said since 2008. But it's more the same, and I don't think there's been another sizable report since 2008, so I'm not sure how much there is to read there. So that's section 108. Just because libraries and archives have all these copyright superpowers, it does not preclude us from taking advantage of the same exemptions that other ordinary citizens have access to, too. And that was something that actually just stood up in a recent court case. The libraries still get access to all these other things, too. We have the same exemptions other people do. Section 107 on fair use, which I think a lot of you are familiar with or have passing familiarity with. And that Deb Silver will be going into in detail this time next week, same bat time, same bat channel. So I won't get into it too much there. Section 109, which is the first sale doctrine, which is the reason that libraries can do what they do. Section 109 of Title 17 says the copyright owners only control the first distribution of a copy of the work. Once a publisher sells it to a library, the library can do whatever it wants. Once you've bought a book at the bookstore, you're allowed to do anything you want with it. You can loan it to a friend, you can sell it back to another bookstore. All that stuff is legal because of Section 109. Libraries couldn't really exist without it. So even though we don't think about it on a daily basis, it's an important exemption for libraries and archives. And then Section 121 deals with making copies for people with print disabilities. If there's not a Braille edition out there or something, if there's not, this is why we can OCR things and teach computers to read text out loud. This is why people make good money closed captioning films that get shown in class, actually. And those kind of things are allowable under Section 121 and University Libraries law. So it's worth it. Is there any questions about that? So that brings us to the end of our formal presentation and discussion part. There are some sources for further reading on copyright law and libraries. I consulted all of these in creating these slides today, and I think they're all terrific. I have copies upstairs if you want to borrow them. But they're worth going out and getting on your own, too.
Could you make complete scans of each of those?
Let's go back. I bought them all, which means that they're very fair market prices. Archivist money is not money. So that brings us to the end of the formal presentation. I'd like to open up the floor to any questions or comments that anybody has about library exemptions or about any other part of copyright. Yes?
Last exception, you mentioned the print disability ones. Is that why large print books are such a big thing that happen, that they usually roll out after paperback editions? Because they reach a certain amount of popularity, people with like certain vision impairments can use those.
I don't know. It's a good question. Anybody familiar enough with U.S. publishing? I actually don't know. Let's look it up. Look it up and let me know.
What was the question?
Huh?
Sorry.
Oh, no, it's okay. If large print books are under that last exception we talked about, the one about print disabilities, which is 121.
I feel like those editions are usually published by the same people that publish the regular edition. So the point is kind of moot because they already control the copyright. And then thus, if they're producing their own large print copy, that it doesn't really open the door for anyone else to make their own because they can't claim that it's not available in the market. Does that make sense? Anybody else? get the whole copyright, almost the entire copyright workshop group here. This is your chance to ask complicated copyright questions. No? Okay. Well, there's
So
one.
I have one. For instructors that are doing online instruction and they embed different types of resources into like a Canvas or a Blackboard, are there copyright, issues for them? Or do they have some kind of exemption to distribute, perhaps textbook scans or other?
It's a very good question. I'm going to defer.
Sure.
I'm
Well,
gonna defer.
when you say
Yeah.
embed, do you mean like use embed code?
Modules that like they can put, I mean like put up scans that they did of a book that they purchased themselves to share.
Like actually upload?
Right, files of textbooks or.
Yeah, not books in their entirety. Usually it would be, we would recommend that instructors use the same guidelines that we use for electronic course reserves, which is, typically 10% of like the total page count or one chapter, whichever is greater. And yeah, that's the guideline we use in the libraries, and the Georgia State University reserves case, they were using the same guidelines, and the court found that like over 90% of the materials they looked at were used in a way consistent with their use.
What about like journal articles?
So journal articles, it really depends on the license for the articles. In most cases, like one article from an issue is only going to be like 10% of the total page count anyway, so you could probably upload a piece like a scanned copy or a digital copy under fair use. But in many cases, like the licenses that we sign, the electronic resources licenses will, have affordances for using the content and for instructional purposes in a learning management system. So it might even be covered under the terms of the license, but those all vary. Like it's kind of a mess, and it's really difficult. Like public, our patrons don't really have access to the terms of the licenses. We don't even have a good understanding of the libraries. Like someone would literally need to go and check the terms of the license to give you a definite answer if you were wanting to take that angle. But as I said before, I don't think you need to rely on that because fair use would cover in most cases.
It's a very good question.
And of course, the best practice is always to ask or encourage instructors to just hyperlink, like use the kernel link to the database, so that you're not actually creating a copy. That's why, like when you embed things using embed codes, there's no copyright concern, because, like, so for instance, if in YouTube, you can get an embed code and then put that onto your course page, or even just on the public any web page. And the idea there is that it's streaming the content from YouTube, and so if the owner of that video decided, hey, I don't want this to be public anymore, and then unlisted it, that link would break. So they've maintained control over the content.
Anybody else? All right, well, thanks for coming today, guys.